So welcome back to the Defiant Spirit podcast, this edition Wealth 360, where we bring together the Enneagram, the work of Dr. Viktor Frankl and his meaning-centered living, and of course, applying it to our daily lives in the form of all things wealth, finance, money. And I'm here with my good friend, my partner in Wealth 360 and financial guru, Michael Feiner. What's happening, Michael?
It's great to be here and very timely since the markets are fluctuating a lot. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's not even having you anymore. This is our
I know.
project together. We're
I
doing
know.
this. This is happening.
Well, you're the leader of this project. I'm on for the ride a little bit, but I
Well,
appreciate the thought.
I'm glad to have you along for the ride. And anybody who's just tuning in, the Defiant Spirit is my particular work around, like as I mentioned. And by the way, I'm Baruch, also known as B. Halevi, and I am the founder of Soul Centered, and my sort of signature work is around the Defiant Spirit, and that is this idea that Dr. Viktor Frankl said, well, actually, even better than talking about it, let's look at it. For those of you who are joining us on video, we have some slides. For those who are just listening, it's fine. We'll walk you and talk you through it. But Dr. Viktor Frankl's sort of thesis, Holocaust survivor, by the way, author of Man's Search for Meaning and 30 some odd other books, founder of logotherapy, meaning-centered living or therapy. And it really revolves for me around Dr. Frankl's message of between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our happiness. So essentially, when things happen to us, right, do we react or do we respond? Do we go down this path of unconscious and fear, which is totally natural, right? Or do we defy our nature, rise above it, supernatural, and respond and choose our response? And that's really the work of life. That's the work of becoming conscious and really crafting the life that we desire. And nothing brings it up, as I've seen, more than money, more than finance, more than our wealth, or sometimes lack thereof, and all the stuff that comes up. And then we react. Well, Michael teaches also now this work of the Defiant Spirit and how to stop reacting and start responding. And so that's our joint project in this Wealth 360 venture. And so today, what are we talking about, Michael?
Well, we're talking about how people react and respond based on their particular Enneagram number, which is sort of the idea that depending on your traits and personality traits, I suppose, that you have different reaction points.
Yep. And they're triggered, right? Those reaction points are triggered under stress, under fear. We all go into it, and we each have a kind of a default mechanism that keeps us surviving. It's a survival technique, and so we don't think about it. We just go into it. And if you're just joining us for the first time, our previous podcast, we walked through all 9 types and talked about the general kind of essence of each of the Enneagram numbers or types, and we all default to one. Although people say to me all the time, well, I feel like I'm a 9 and a 2. Well, you're all of these things. It's just the question is, how do you rank order them, not consciously, unconsciously, and do triage when you're on, in Michael's language, the battlefield, right? We start going through these as strategies to survive. And so we all have a default core type, but we have all of these numbers in us. And when the storms of life hit, we draw upon these things. And I don't say storms of life lightly, because as we're recording this, we're still in the near aftermath of the hurricanes down in Florida. By the way, Michael, I know you have offices down in Florida. How is everything down there?
Luckily and thankfully, things worked out pretty well. No flooding at our location, so for us, things are good. But talking to some other people, there's a lot of devastation. I guess it's going to be the most devastating hurricane that Florida's ever encountered, which is, I don't want to say it's hard to believe because Hurricane Andrew was brutal and stuff like that, but devastation on the West Coast from Marco Island up to Fort Myers is incredible.
Your place, your office is in Naples, is that correct?
Naples,
Yeah.
Naples. Luckily, it's kind of second floor, and while the water came, it receded and stuff like that. So we're fortunate that way, but the human devastation is enormous. Talking to
So
people who need things, so we have a lot to be thankful for.
So, this podcast is for those folks surviving those storms and the aftermath, rebuilding their life. It's for, you, if you're listening, if you're going through a personal storm. It doesn't have to be just finance. Although, finance is tied to each one of these things, although that's not the most important thing. It's an important thing. And, whether you're going through a divorce, whether you've lost a loved one, whether you're just living life in this kind of semi post COVID time, we all face the storms. The question is, do we react or do we respond? Well, the Enneagram helps us see a roadmap of where we go, at least initially in reaction. And so if you're watching this right now, you can see the slide. Oops, go back. You can see the slide and it says core fear. And if you're not watching and you're listening, just shoot me an email at Baruch, Baruch, at mysoulcenter.org, or jump over to the website, defiantspirit.org, and you can shoot me an email and I'll send you the slide. But what it does is it lists the 9 basic core fears. Again, all of them in us, but there's one primary fear that we go to when the storms of life descend upon us. And this is our immediate reaction. And as Michael and I teach, you don't have to live in reaction. You can choose your response. All right. So let's start with an Enneagram 1, Michael. If you're an Enneagram 1 and the storms of life literally or figuratively descend upon you, right? The one, the perfectionist, I call it the reformer. Just give us a brief snapshot of what you imagine, because you know quite a few ones in your business, what the ones go through in their fear.
I think that the ones typically like structure. They're perfectionists. They like order. They like structure. They like routine. Um, so, if the stock market, for example, is erratic and extremely volatile, that provides disorder to the universe.
Mhm.
And that's uncomfortable, fearful. It can cause disruption in their lives.
And you know better than I do or anybody, that there really is no such thing as order with the stock market, right? I mean, isn't that like a kind of an oxymoron?
There, it is in a sense, the stock market, in a way, I'm trying to think, the stock market itself sometimes is a six, sometimes it's a one, sometimes it's an eight. Over really long periods of time, the stock market is very linear, right? The rates of return are consistent over
Mhm,
extreme long periods of time. So, in the short run, the stock market tends to be very volatile. You
mhm.
don't know if you're going to have a huge, positive year, possibly a large negative year, or something in between. So it is very schizophrenic in that sense. So you're right. It causes a lot of issues because it's unpredictable at best.
So if you're an Enneagram 1 and you really gravitate towards structure, towards order, towards linear, I mean, I have a son who's an Enneagram 1. I'll keep saying the names just in case anybody's joining us doesn't know what we're talking about. It's the reformer. He craves structure, and you can feel transitions are very hard for him. Once he gets into his rhythm, he's good again. But your point is so well taken, right? That the stock market really does have an order or structure. And you taught me this a few years ago when you sent, maybe it was around the beginning of COVID. You sent me a slide on a graph of the stock market over the past 100 years or something like that. And if you zoom in, it's a bumpy ride. But if you zoom out, it's a really smooth ride. It's like a 45-degree angle up and just kind of this constant trajectory of growth. And the more you zoom in, the more you kind of start to panic and look at the highs and the lows. The more you zoom out, the more you can see the constancy or the order. And I guess that's probably a good strategy for somebody going an Enneagram 1 going through some storms.
That's exactly right for an Enneagram 1 to understand that maybe looking at day to day fluctuations are not helpful because they cause enormous probably magnified stress versus other Enneagram types, when in fact, over the long term, it's doing exactly what a one would want, which is that consistent upward momentum. But that's hard. Like I think you've given me the term focus in, focus out. If you focus out on the Google map, it looks remarkably steady.
Mhm.
If you focus in, it looks remarkably volatile. It's mind-boggling, and it probably 10-year time frames are remarkably steady. 5 years are getting there, but any 1 to 3 year time frame can be the zoom in versus zoom out. So now that I know someone's an Enneagram 1, what I try to do is explain, like, let's look at that long term ride, so versus the short term ride.
Unbelievable that you're bringing this into your work because, per our last or one of our previous conversations, you know better than I that so much of your work revolves around the feelings, the experiences people are having around their money, not just the money. And so if you can talk to somebody's core fear, right, and help them address it with real strategies like this, wow, what a gift. So zoom out, all ones, when you are going through financial or physical or relationship storms. Zoom out, look at the long game, the big picture, and not the moment to moment, and you'll see the structure, the order, the perfection that your soul, your being craves. All right, Enneagram 2. Enneagram 2 is the helper, the supporter, the nurturer, called different things in different systems. But when you're with a 2. Frankly, when you're with most types. A 2 is the quintessential mother or father figure. They just are relationship oriented. So, storms of life descend, financial, otherwise. What happens to the 2s in your practice or in your world, Michael?
I think a two, unlike a one who craves structure, tends to be nervous that they can't meet their obligations to their loved ones, or that something may be at risk to help their child to college or their grandchild start a business, or whatever it may be. So
Mhm.
it's a fear, and they're just as stressed, just in a completely different way. And we probably, and I don't know if it's because ones and twos are next to each other, probably talk about the zoom in, zoom out also, to say, hey, let's look at perspective. Long term, we can meet your goals. Short term, we have to be able to ride the so-called roller coaster, which is hard. Different people in the circle of this Enneagram can ride the roller coaster differently. Some like it. So we'll get to parts of the Enneagram who are like, oh, the roller coaster, they embrace it. It's not
Right,
fear, it's actually adrenaline. And
right.
some people on the roller coaster are hanging on for it's white knuckle.
Yep.
So I think that is their fear of not meeting the expectations of taking care of their close associates, loved ones.
It's amazing to me because I have a lot of 2s in my practice, and everything is seen through the lens of relationship. Every single thing. And it's not that ones or I'm an 8 or you're a 3 don't care about relationship. All human beings, well, not unless you're a sociopath, you care about the people in your life. But um, but 2s reframe everything, at least in the initial reaction, as as the people in my life. And so, we even talked about, as we're building out our Enneagram Wealth 360 philosophy, we renamed, originally, I forget what we called the 2 investor, but we reframed them to the legacy investor, because with 2s, it's not even about who's alive around me, it's about who comes after me,
Right.
children's children. And so, zooming out, seeing that the well-being, the wellness of generationally, like, we're okay as a collective, we're okay over the long haul. Right now we're struggling, right now we're rebuilding. So I think, really, for 2s, zooming out and seeing the long game of the relationships, but maybe even zooming in and seeing, yes, I'm so sorry you lost XYZ, but look at what we have, and we still have our relationship. We still have each other. So really, for 2s, getting back to this relationship, I think, is a grounding element in our lives. And to me, that's an anchor for the 2s. Anything else with the twos and weathering the storms?
No, I think that, the twos are, like you said, kind of forward looking for their legacies. And that's so important to understand because you just can't come at a two with complete analytics.
Mhm.
And that's what you've taught me. My approach always was, hey, let me explain logically why over a 20-year time period you're going to make money. And I didn't realize I was losing people because they didn't, that's nice, but that wasn't the perspective that they wanted to understand or that they could process. It worked for a couple of Enneagram types, but not for that type.
And
So,
twos, like everybody else, want to get there, but the question is, you've been on the battlefield literally, as a general in the National Guard. You've seen firsthand people's reasoning goes out the window when firefight starts, right? And you go to your default. You can't have a meaningful conversation about the meaning of life while you're on the battlefield.
well, we're talking about obviously the Enneagram, but I think the most important thing, you know, that you have taught me was what you started with in this conversation, which was that Viktor Frankl quote of reaction versus response. And that little bit of time in between is is the takeaway from this podcast and this video. And the takeaway from my life is there is a chance to override your natural instinct, the so-called system one versus system two. However, the researchers now look at how a brain is organized. I think I said this before that Dr. Frankel, you know, understood this and figured this out long before MRIs, brain mapping, realized that we have an internal innate fear response, and whether it's road rage, whether it's on the battlefield, whether it's interactions with family, you initially react to things, and the ability to advance to response versus pure reaction, I think, is the difference between a successful investor and unsuccessful investor. The ability not to just react to things that could be irrational. The more calm you are, whether it's in the battlefield, whether it's in business, whether it's in life, presumably you can make better decisions.
That's right. It comes down to, are you going to react or are you going to respond? And the choice between stimulus and response. And that's what we're talking about for anybody listening, to give you more strategies, more tools to stop reacting, to choose your response. Enneagram 3, Michael's favorite. Michael's pretty hard on threes because he is a three. In fact, everybody does that. Everybody gets the ick factor around their own type. That's how you know you're kind of in your type. Like, yeah, there's a shadow side to threes. It doesn't bother me so much because I'm not a three. We'll get to the eights, and I get a little queasy sometimes. So, Michael, tell us about the threes.
Well, threes are achievement oriented. They are image oriented, and they're sort of action oriented. Probably the most action oriented of the group, and that has a lot of pros and cons. I like, for any initial reaction, anything that happens to me, I want to take an action immediately,
Hmm.
and that's not always the best approach. So that's why this was so important to me, the reaction versus response, because now I'm trying to build that time frame in between when I'm thinking about it. Okay, I know I want to take action on everything,
Mhm.
no matter what it is. You could name anything, and I immediately like, let me solve the problem. And that just isn't necessarily the best approach. Where sometimes you need to digest better and deal with things a bit differently. I don't want to say be more patient, but action isn't always the best course of action, if you will.
It's true. I think that's why threes end up in trouble when they don't do this work, when they react and they step on the gas. I don't have to tell you, winter's just around the corner for you there in New England, and there's going to be ice from about like October to May. It seems like in
Thanks.
June. Yeah, you're welcome. And when you're driving on the ice and you are skidding, the last thing you do is step on the brakes. Better to do nothing, and that's the antithesis of how a three is wired. A three is wired to do something. Um, Teacher of mine, Sylvia Borstein, who is a Buddhist, she talks about, she has a book that says, don't just do something, sit there. And that's the antithesis of the three's reaction when it hits the fan. So do nothing. Be lazy, Mick. Do
Well,
less.
yeah, no, I'm not wired that way, but now knowing you, after I took the survey that I am a three, and now dealing with other threes, because I know the threes actually are pretty good. Like if you have a down stock market right now, all my all my clients or friends or associates who may be threes, what are they calling for? Not worrying about losing their money. They're like, hey, how come we're not buying more when the market's getting killed?
Yes.
Because shouldn't we be able to make money when the market's going down? That's an interesting, right? I get those calls, those texts. So that's a fascinating. They have a different perspective. They're
Yep.
like, am I missing out on buying something low versus losing my money? Right. So completely different than the two would react.
Because threes think in terms of success and failure. So the core fear of a three is failure. Well, back to your slide of the upward trajectory of the market, this isn't failure. This is a buying opportunity from the lens of a three. From the lens of a two, it might be, what about my grandchildren's
Right.
529 college savings? From a one, it might be, but I feel out of control. So each one just goes through this, and we can all get to this place of response. We're just learning our basic fear and how we might react. Threes and failure and success. Fours, the creative, the individualist, the romantic. This is the artist type. The core fear for a four is, this kind of worth. Lots of things will take them. I have a wife who's a four, down into the kind of, worthiness and am I worthy? Four is probably the least represented, at least in your profession, Michael. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so. I probably have the least fours, and it's probably an area I understand the least too, of how to interact with fours, if you will. Fours are, kind of the genius creative people too. I mean, they're can be amazingly creative and do things that you'd never even think. They tend to be laissez-faire, hands-off with regard to finances, which I think if we've talked about this before, probably serves them pretty well if they have a professional that can help them.
That's right.
Because I think the one thing that in financial world the studies have shown is not necessarily that a financial planner or professional can pick better investments than the next person, but what a financial advisor typically does is remove some of the fear pieces to say, hey, stay in the market, don't sell during really bad times, make sure your money is invested for the long haul. But people might not do that. Even now, people like, shouldn't I have everything in cash? That strategy just is hard to get great rates of return over time.
Yeah, I don't think there are many fours, certainly on the professional side. Of course, all fours invest their money or have money or grapple with money like the rest of us. My wife being a four, it's interesting. You just kind of nailed it. All she wants is somebody who knows money. You, you're our financial planner. And that's enough. She just turns it over. She doesn't look at the markets. She doesn't, she hears about the fear. Maybe she feels the fear of, what's going on with the markets. But she basically said to me the other day, what does Mick say? What does Michael say? Sorry, I call you Mick. What does Michael say? Is it okay? Are we okay? And that's enough. You said, yes, we're good. Here's why. And forward. And I like that about fours because what they're passionate about, but they're not jacks of all trades. They're masters of their space and they turn the
Yeah.
rest over to the expert. And there's a lot of humility in that for the fours out there. So yes. Fives, lots of fives, lots of fives who have wealth because fives are the thinking, the core thinking type. They are built for the information age. They're probably a disproportionate amount of Silicon Valley, at least on the tech side, probably not on the interfacing side. The Mark Zuckerbergs, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts. Tell us a little bit about fives and fear.
Yeah, I mean, the fives are very analytical, like you said, thinkers, reflectors. So they tend to be good investors, but their core fear, I think, is not having enough information, enough knowledge to make decisions. And if something's fast paced and moving, it can make them very, very uncomfortable if something isn't rational either. So if a stock market is dropping or increasing and it's not rational, that's fearful to sometimes a five, because they don't understand how that could possibly be. And in the short run, as we know, the stock market in a way is an emotional entity in the short run, right? Buys and sells in the short run. In the long run, it tends to be more rational and based on earnings. The real problem is I don't know the difference between the exact time difference between the short run and the long run, right? When that the emotional part of the market right now will give way to the rational part of the market.
Yeah, and across the board in all things, fives just need information. They need to understand. They feel out of control when they don't know what's going on, when they don't understand what's going on. When I was involved in the cannabis industry and raising money for one of the companies I was involved with, I don't think we had a single five investor because they didn't understand the cannabis space that was emerging as, newly out of nowhere legalized cannabis. People still don't understand it. And I would imagine, that's an industry where you're going to find very few fives because you got to be able to wrap your head around and understand how things fit together. And so for fives, it's about getting information, getting knowledge. And if you have a five in your life, by the way, you don't want to surprise fives. They are the least likely to want a surprise birthday party because
Really.
it's just like they didn't have time to think it through, process it,
You're
plan
funny.
for it. So, as Michael's working with his fives, as I have fives in my life, if you have fives in yours, or if you are a five, as much information as possible and as long a lead time as possible. All right, Enneagram 6. Enneagram 6, the loyalist, sometimes called the loyal skeptic, sometimes called the devil advocate. Sixes probably are having the hardest time when you get into the storms. Long haul, they're great. Storms of life, they're not always so wired for this, maybe quite like a three. Tell us about the six.
Yeah, again, with the fours and the sixes are the areas that I'm trying to learn the most about. I sort of know a six maybe when I see it, if you will, but it's hard because again, they're great people, they're great team players, they are great in groups, but their fear tends to be magnified versus other people in in times of stress. I think
Yeah.
financial and physical, and they tend to be a bit more skeptical than some other Enneagram numbers. So that's an area that I've learned that I know if I have someone who I think might be a six or have six traits, that I want to work with a little more deeply during turbulent times to be more reassuring, whether it's explain things or just talk. Sometimes
Uh,
they just want to be, I think you've taught me they just want to be heard sometimes, you know, to some degree, right? And talk to and so forth.
So sixes, it's interesting because you're pointing out the reactive types, fours, sixes, and eights, but we'll get to eights. Eights are different, but fours and sixes primarily are the two of the most reactive types. And so if you add now the storms of life, whatever those might be, right? That's just all about reaction, and they're they're not really wired for. Well, it's not true that they're not wired for it. Sixes are worst case scenario preppers, planners. They're the ones probably
Right.
who had all the toilet paper during the COVID pandemic, right? They're the ones who have plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So in some ways they're prepared for it, but in other ways it's almost like this told you so kind of thing. And it's hard to get them out of their fear and back onto the ground. Now, once they do, they're good, but you're describing how they get there. They land back on their feet by questioning, right? By probing,
Mm.
by interrogating. And it almost feels like when a six is in fear, like you're being interrogated. And as long as you don't take it personally and you understand this is how they get their sea legs back, that they're trying to ground down by probing and questioning, because that they're testing you, Michael, as their financial planner. Do you got this? And once you've satisfactorily, is that a word? answered their questions, you get them back to their stability. That's the experience of a six. I think you have probably a lot of sixes, I would imagine.
I think anecdotally, there are a lot of sixes just in general in the population.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that's right. I do have a lot, and that's the area I'm trying to learn best to help
They're the
and
hardest.
to understand.
They're the hardest to understand. They're the hardest to type when I'm working with somebody on typing. If we don't know what they are, I would say more often than not they're a six, because there's this ambivalence, this
Mm,
even on a questionnaire, it's pretty extensive questionnaires, and there's just this ambivalence that, like, what if, and if I answer this way and if I don't. So sometimes I know they're a six by how hard it is to type them. So yes, Enneagram 6, right? Get your sea legs, get your grounding, you go through your process. And if you want somebody to listen to you, Michael is really, I think, now very aware of what sixes need, and they need to process that fear to get to the
mm.
strength. All right, three more. Enneagram 7. Now, Enneagram 7, probably everybody's favorite, life of the party, uplifting, optimistic. They're called the enthusiasts. Sometimes they're called the optimists. When you're with a 7, just kind of like when you're with a 2. Sevens are just upbeat, energetic people. Tell us a little bit about what you know about the sevens, Michael.
No, I think the sevens are adventurous. They look to maximize probably everything in life to the extent that they can, and they're probably the least inhibited, maybe in so many ways. So those are the guys and girls and
And
who
dogs. And dogs.
and
Yeah,
dogs. My
Apollo.
dog is. I think my dog's a seven. My golden retriever Apollo is probably a seven. Right, just always happy, always wants to be with people. Um, they're great, except hey, I just heard about this weird stock that's gonna make 10 times our money next week, type of thing. They're always looking. They're optimistic and sometimes just have to be helped from probably being too optimistic or from taking too many adventurous moves, if you will. Probably most likely to invest in something crazy.
Yes. You nailed it. Sevens, and it looks always like fun and games, right? I want to be a 7, but there's a shadow side to everything. And that optimism or that positivity can become, as I call, toxic positivity, right? If you're unwilling to look at the holes, unwilling to look at the downside. And so that's one way sevens will get themselves into trouble, is that toxic positivity, and not, I've worked with a bunch of sevens in the startup space, and because I would say if Silicon Valley is the COO or the CTO is a 5, the CEO or the founder is probably a 7 statistically. And so sevens can be great startup founders, but they're not always great at scaling up, because to scale up a business, you got to really deal with the nitty gritty, and you got to look at all the data, not just the positive feedback. And so sevens can get themselves into trouble in that space. And the other thing is, they don't like constraints. It's a core fear for a 7. And it's not just like constraints, it's limitations. It's the inability to go out and experience it all. And so when you lose your resources, whether it be your home in Florida, God forbid, or your money in, in your portfolio, there's this feeling of fear that starts kicking in. So it's a very different type of fear, I think, than the rest of the Enneagram types.
For
So
sure.
Enneagram 7s. Yep. Anything else, Michael?
No, I think, like you said, they're always not looking at the downside or the potential losses. Every situation can be turned into optimism, which is great. Like you said, that's why they're great entrepreneurs and founders. But you do have to look at downside of things. Most things do have a downside, so you have to weigh that logically.
So if you are an Enneagram 7 and you want to be brought down, call Michael or I. We'll bring you down to the ground.
We'll be the Debbie Downers. Help
um,
restrain it.
we'll
Well, here
help
you
you.
go. Go right on to the 8. You'll take care of the sevens because that's your nature, right?
Yeah, so
Eight.
I do. I kind of poke holes for the 7. So let's move on to the 8. The Enneagram 8 is the challenger. And jumping back and forth between slides here. The challenger, the I don't know, there's different words, the maverick, the boss, but whatever it is, it's probably the most intense energy of the Enneagram. Probably the most built for the storms. And in some ways, it's interesting. As an 8, I do better with storms than I do with the mundane, with the ordinary. I struggle sometimes, and I'll make a mess when I'm in the ordinary, when things are just coasting, almost if I'm not aware, to feel some excitement, right? Especially when I was like, in the teens and 20s, I would be known to stir it up, to feel something. Well, when the storms of life come, and as you get older, you don't have to stir it up because they stir it up for you. So I'm well built, and I think most 8s are well built for the storms. It's the quiet that we struggle with more. But tell us about your experience of 8s and the storms of the markets, or anything else.
I think I have a lot of experience with 8s because I think a lot of people in the military are 8s, the people who want to be in charge, who are leaders, who like control of things, and not in a good way. They want to provide direction. So when you want to provide direction, you have thoughts on how things should go, and something goes against that, that is discontent for an 8.
Right.
And the 8s that I talk to tend to be very logical people, but they need to have interaction to understand quickly, because they're probably, and you're like this, right? They're the fastest moving of the group, it seems.
3 and 8s.
Yeah. 8s just, but I think in a sense of just wanting to get things done. So they need, when they either face fear or disruption, they need that reaction or the activity from their partners or their stakeholders quickly to understand what's going on. As soon as they understand, they're amazingly calm and easy. It's when they don't understand, they get frustrated quickly.
That's right. And so not so different than the 3s, right? To slow it down. It's always important for 3s and 8s and sometimes 7s to slow it down, for 8s to get back into your body. Like 8s like just fly out of their body. It's almost like, it's like this out of body experience. They move so fast. And so to get back into your body, to take some deep breaths, ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, 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 fire. Oops, I forgot to aim. So get back into that kind of control, because that's what really stirs up an 8 in the storms, is they feel out of control. So they're going into overdrive to take control. But like the 3s, that doesn't always work so well. All right, we're going to wrap it up with Enneagram 9, everybody's favorite. 7s are fun, but 9s are easy. 9s are the peacemaker. They are the most peaceful type on the Enneagram. I'd say most of my clients are 9s. Many of them are 9s. My sister, my daughter. When you're with a 9 because your heart rate decreases. When you're with an 8, your heart rate increases. But when you're with a 9, it decreases, and you can breathe and you can rest easier. Now, they're probably the least well built for the storms of life. You see this oftentimes in the Enneagram, yin yang next to each other. 8s built for it, 9s not so much. They don't like conflict. Let's wrap it up. Tell us a little bit about the 9s.
Yeah, I find the 9's the hardest, and you've taught me my 3 is connected to 9. 9 is my opposite in the Enneagram sense. I didn't know that. I kind of felt that over time when I'm interacting sometimes with 9s. I want to, take action or do something or discuss it, and they'll agree with me no matter what I have to say. And a 3 can get frustrated with a 9 wants to be agreeable. So I think the hard 9, like you said, are the calm people. But sometimes you don't know how they're really feeling as a result, and how to help them sometimes because they're so agreeable.
Right.
It's almost easier to be disagreeable and help someone, because at least a 9, like you said, they're a pleasure to be around for sure. And some amazing leaders and people who are 9s. From an investing in wealth perspective, that's probably one of the more challenging Enneagrams, to really dig deep to see what and how to best impact.
From what I remember on the on your Enneagram profile, 9 is like almost non-existent, right? So your 3 is your top number, your 9 is your bottom.
I was stunned when you did it, that 3 was my highest, and 9 was clearly my lowest.
And 6 was in the
And
middle
on the
somewhere.
Enneagram, it shows that contradiction. And then 6, I think I was in the middle. So I was like, wow, this thing kind of does have an amazing congruence to it.
Yeah, it's sort of mathematics. You really can't be a 3 and a 9 simultaneously at a reactive level. Now you can choose to respond, and for the 9s listening, conflict is your pathway back to your truth. You have to go through it as a 9 in order to grow through it. And if you spend your life doing what I call avoidance, a void dance, a dance around the void, you just keep dancing around it and around it. Well, the storms present to you, 9s, all of us, an opportunity for growth, not the ones you want, the one you got. Don't ask for these things, but once you have them on your plate, either you can spend your life avoiding conflict, which is ultimately avoiding growth, or you can, as Dr. Frankel says, make your stand, the defiant power of the human spirit, find that place within you. You have what you need to face the conflict and to move through it. And those are really the core fears and some strategies for anybody as you're going through life. The storms descend. They have descended. If they haven't descended, they will descend. But don't worry, to our 7s out there, the sun will rise tomorrow. How do we get there? By doing the work, by taking back our power, learning how to stop reacting and start responding. Any last words for us, Michael?
No, this was an amazing session. Thank you for bringing up Dr. Frankel and going through these 9 core fears and how it relates to wealth and life.
Thank you. Thanks for being my partner on this side of Wealth 360. And anybody who wants to learn more about Michael, jump over to finer.com. You can jump over to the defiantspirit.org, and you can definitely tune in next time because we're going to continue this show. Thank you so much, and defy your number and live your spirit at all times in life, especially during the storms of life. Thank you.